Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to the Schwenkfelder Library and Heritage Center. I want to thank Patrick Donmoyer here for coming in and doing a presentation on Mountain Mary. Please, if you may, silence your cell phones so we don't have anything going off during our presentation, as well as hold any questions until the end. And those on the Zoom, please use the Q&A option to ask any questions you may have throughout the presentation. And I will turn it over. Welcome.
All righty. Many thanks to everyone at Schwenkfelder for having me here today. My name is Patrick Donmoyer. I'm director of the Pennsylvania German Cultural Heritage Center, and today I'm going to be speaking about a topic that is very near and dear to my heart. Back in 2022, I had worked to organize a Mountain Mary retrospective exhibition at the Pennsylvania German Cultural Heritage Center at Kutztown University. This was envisioned during the time of lockdown when people were not visiting museums in person as much, and there was an interest in supporting the arts and artists during that time. I worked with several different artists who were locked down at that point in time to produce images connected with the Mountain Mary narrative. And many of these people were folks who had already been exploring aspects of the legends of Mountain Mary. And one thing led to the next. We put together a large retrospective on Mountain Mary, including a number of original artifacts that you'll see in my presentation today as well, that will explore this legendary figure. Now, Mountain Mary has been immortalized in works of art and celebrated in poetry for many generations, even since the middle of and technically the early 19th century. At one point in time, when Mountain Mary died in 1819, her funeral was the most well-attended, according to popular opinion at that time, was the most well-attended funeral in the history of Berks County, Pennsylvania, speaking, of course, volumes to Mountain Mary's influence throughout the region during the time of her life and following her death. Now, the interesting thing with Mountain Mary, of course, is that there are many different views of Mountain Mary. And many of these are derived not so much from the substance of her life, but the way in which her legend continued to elaborate over the years after her passing. These are some examples of some of the works that were produced by local artists for our Mountain Mary exhibition. You'll see some that are very traditional, showing an 18th century woman. You'll find examples of Mountain Mary as a child, Mountain Mary as a healer, Mountain Mary as a mystical healer, and many other different forms. And what's fascinating about the Mountain Mary story to me is that here we have an opportunity to examine the way that she continues to be relevant to present-day populations of people. Many different people have a different take on Mountain Mary, but she's meaningful to everyone. Somehow there is something specific in this legend that has perennial appeal, and that's what we're going to be exploring today. Not just the actual aspects of her life that we know to be true, but then the ways in which many people have interpreted her life and her legacy long after her passing. There we are. Today, we're going to explore Mountain Mary in particular through 4 different lenses. Mountain Mary was a first-generation immigrant to Pennsylvania. She was German-speaking. So we're going to interpret that aspect of her life, which there's probably the least amount of information about her immigration story. Also, as a farmer and an entrepreneur, she was a single person living at a farm for roughly 20 years by herself. And during that time, she accrued a substantial amount of money for herself, so much so that she was able to provide for her heirs after her passing, and was considered a highly successful and highly profitable farmer. So this is an important part of her story as well. We're going to also look especially at her story as a healer and an herbalist, which I think really has perhaps some of the most appeal of her story throughout the years, especially with the attention that people have given over the years to Pennsylvania German healing traditions, some that are botanical in nature and others that might be ritual in nature. And especially with Mountain Mary's story, after her passing, she was venerated locally as essentially a folk saint among a largely Protestant group of people. And there's some interesting aspects to her story that come to light long after her passing, because of course, there were people who knew her, who recorded things about her, and those things gradually surfaced and became part of what we know today about Mountain Mary. But many of those sources were never available even in the 19th century. So we're going to examine her life through through a number of different primary sources, as well as through a number of different perspectives of people who wrote about her following her death. Oops, and I'm getting used to, there we go. All right. When we look at Mountain Mary's immigrant story, this is perhaps one of the aspects of her life that we know the least about. In fact, we don't even know precisely what year she was born. Some say, and this is probably the most popular perception you'll hear, that she was born in 1749. And people will say that she lived to the age of 70 years. But there is a primary source from just after she died that said she was 75. That was perhaps closest to the time. So some folks, including myself, believe she was born in 1744. Prior to 1765, there were no fewer than 14 different families with the name of Jung that emigrated to Pennsylvania. And if her father's name was Heinrich, as some people have suggested, there's just under a dozen possibilities. And during that time, we have ship lists that list many different immigrant families, usually by heads of household, but occasionally it will list men, women, and children. There is no listing for a Jung family that includes anyone by the name of Anna Maria Jung, which is Mountain Mary's name. And this is an interesting thing. So in lieu of having any form of a narrative associated with her immigrant story, over time, people elaborated and they filled in some specifics. And the most popular versions of her immigrant story were put together by the same person. His name was Ludwig Augustus Wollenweber. He was the editor of a newspaper called the Philadelphia Democrat. He was a German-American immigrant to Pennsylvania. I say German-American because he arrived in the 1840s, which is an interesting situation given the fact that he would have been after that time that many people would consider the kind of cutoff point for the Pennsylvania German culture, which of course was largely colonial era and shortly thereafter. Following that time, many of the Germans who came were culturally different than those who had come primarily in the 18th century. Wollenweber very much took Mountain Mary's story in two directions. He wrote a series of sketches about Pennsylvania German life, and he wrote it in a mixture of his own Palatine dialect, because he was from the Rhine River Valley, which is the same point of origin for many Pennsylvania Dutch families. And he mixed it with Pennsylvania German, and he wrote an account saying that there's this young woman named Mountain Mary, and she lived all by herself. And he warns, well, don't assume that just because she lived by herself, all out in the woods by herself, that she was dirty or haggard or whatever else. So he brings with it all of these different pejorative sentiments that he's looking to try to overturn. He refers to as a hermit and feels the need to defend her honor in some sense. He goes on to say that she immigrated to Pennsylvania because she was trying to elope, and that when she got here, the person she was eloping with, her beau died, and then she was left a widow. So this is one version of her story. However, both stories are not true. We know for a fact, and I'll tell you why. The second story pertains to the idea that she came to Pennsylvania with her family, and her family died on the way, on the boat, and they were buried at sea. But she meets another fellow traveler who's orphaned by the name of Theodore Benz. And Theodore Benz and Mary fall in love, and then they are married by Henry Melchior Muhlenberg in a hasty wedding before Theodore Benz goes off to serve in the Revolution, and he dies in the Revolution and dies in a prison camp. And Mary then is left as a war widow. And both of these stories by Ludwig Augustus Wollenweber suggest that she was a widow, and that her whole story is predicated on the idea that she became a hermit to escape the world because of the loss of a love. And the interesting thing about this is we know for a fact that this was not true. What's fascinating is that Mountain Mary wrote her own will. There have been many accounts over the years that claim that she was an illiterate woman who lived in the woods all by herself, of modest means. Well, she was not of modest means, and she was definitely very literate. She composed her own will in her own hand, and she signed it, Anna Maria Jungen. You'll notice it has the feminine suffix at the end of her name, and that was traditional for Germans of that period. And she lists herself as a spinster, which at that point in time was the official legal term for a woman who was unmarried, even though that is not a term we would want to use today for anyone who is unmarried. And what's really interesting is that she identifies herself as a single woman, and that is a legal designation that would have been officially on the books in Berks County when she registered her will in 1813. She could not have said that if she was a widow. That would have been against the law. So this is a really important fact that she identifies as a single woman. There's a couple other primary source documents that also shed a little bit of light on this early story, because many folks know that she settled in the Oley Valley, specifically on a farm in Pike Township. And this is where she first appears in public documents associated with Pike Township. It's on the 1790 US federal census. And what's interesting is Mary is listed, and you can see her name right there in the English language. Can anybody read what it says after her name? The abbess. And this has created a number of questions over the years, perhaps more questions than we have answers for. Who was Mary and what kind of an abbess was she? So much so that a local census enumerator would have listed her as such. Now, many times the people who were taking the census within their communities would have known some of the people there and their reputations. So this person was probably familiar with Mary and her reputation. But we don't know. Are they implying that she ran a religious community at her property in Pike Township? What we do know is that if you look very carefully at the location, it says that there are 3 women, and you'll see it in the far column. If you look about part of the way down, maybe about 2/3 down, you'll see Mary the abbess, followed over. There are 3 women living there. So she is one of them, and then there are 2 more. And what's interesting, too, is that we have surmised over the years that this was probably her mother and one of her sisters. And we know this because there are documents pertaining to her mother and her sisters. Both of her sisters went on to get married. One of them married a person by the name of Schneider. One of them married a person by the name of Knoll, and later a person by the name of Motz, who actually lived down the road from Mountain Mary. And the interesting thing is, these are likely two members of the family. And the interesting thing is, we don't know, again, how people thought about her as a religious leader, but in some way, folks thought about her commonly enough in that sense that the census enumerator felt that it was appropriate to put that on a legal document. Again, more questions than we have answers. One of the big questions people have all the time is, what was Mountain Mary's religious affiliation? Was she Protestant? Was she Catholic? Was she Anabaptist? Nobody knows. Many people have written because she lived proximal to a Lutheran church, which at one point in time was actually a Union church. That's the Hill Church, and that is located just up the hill from her. I should say up the hill and down the hill from her, also in Pike Township. What's interesting, I went to the Lutheran archives down in Mount Airy to do a little bit of research using that church record, and she appears nowhere in the record, not as a person receiving communion, not as a person sponsoring a baptism. If she went to that church and she was held in such high esteem, you would have thought that someone would have asked her to be a baptismal sponsor, and that is not the case. So we have at least an absence of information pertaining to whether or not she was connected with the Lutheran Church, although many people claim that the minister by the name of Conrad, who was there at the time of her passing, was the person who presided over her funeral. But we don't know that for sure either, because it's not listed in any of the records either. You would have thought such a prominent member of the community, there would have been something there. What we do know is that in the 18th century in Oley, there were as many as 14 different denominations that were historically recorded there. I think I can only maybe name about 10 or 11 of them. There were Lutherans, Reformed, there were Moravians, there were Brethren or Dunkards, there were actually a small contingency of Amish that moved through the area, there were Mennonites. There was a group called the Nygabura, and they were kind of like this offshoot of the Baptist, the German Baptist tradition. There were Jewish families. There was also, of course, English Quakers. And then at one point in time, there were also people who later identified as evangelical, but they were actually a congregation even prior to them being called evangelical. And there were several other denominations behind that. Oh, and Roman Catholics, one of the few Roman Catholic communities. So this is a really interesting thing. Such religious diversity in that area. What did she belong to in terms of religious affiliation? Nobody knows. All right. Now, one group of documents that I'm particularly interested in Mountain Mary's life was owned by a woman by the name of Edith White, or Edith Birch White. I actually have her name reversed on here. It should be the other way around, Edith Birch White. She has an article that was in the Berks County Historical Review in the 1940s. And what's really fascinating about this is that she says, I am the descendant of one of her executors, and I have a bunch of papers associated with her. And she shows one image, this one here, which is an interesting legal agreement that Mountain Mary herself signs, saying that following the death of her two sisters, and with the understanding that there had been an agreement with one of her sisters' widowers by the name of Matthias Motz, who had been using her land, that he was to give the land back to her and that it was to be recognized as legally hers. He could still use it, but it was to be understood that it legally belonged to her and that at the time of her passing, he would have the first option to buy it. And this is really fascinating because they give the names of her two sisters. They gave the name of Katerina Elizabeth, and Katerina was Matthias Motz's wife. There's also Maria Elizabeth, who later married a man by the name of Schneider and went up to Albany, New York. And in fact, that's where they had to advertise to try to get a hold of her heirs after Mary's passing. So this is a really fascinating story that goes far beyond Pennsylvania, far beyond southeastern Pennsylvania, and definitely further than Berks County and the Oley Valley. Now, there's another letter that's in Edith Birch White's collection that she mentions, but there's no image of it, and nobody knows where these documents are, which is really disappointing and sad from a researcher's perspective. She mentions a letter that is from 1779, where a man by the name of Schneider sends her a letter congratulating Mary's mother, whose name was Elizabeth, on having obtained a property in the Oley Valley with her daughters. So we do know that Mary lived there with her mother and at least one other sister during that time, because they do mention plural daughters, but they don't say how many. It's very likely that that Schneider name is connected with Mary's sister, Maria Elizabeth Schneider, who was living in Albany, New York at that point in time. But we don't know because they don't give any original copy of the document for us to examine today, just a little bit of a summary of the letter. So we know that it was actually Mary's mother who obtained the land in the Oley Valley that later became Mary's property. And Mary outlived her sisters and her mother. Now, the property where Mary lived is a fascinating location, and there are only a couple components of Mary's original farmstead that are still there to see today. There is a beautiful bake oven that you can see on the left. The bake oven, you'll see here it no longer has a door on it. The second hole up would have been the door. Bottom below that would have been in place where you'd let the ashes fall through for a trap. But this was a bake oven for baking bread, and it is diagonally adjacent to the milk house that you see on the right. And during the time of Mary's life, she had a sizable dairy herd, and she made her income primarily from her butter and also from bees that we would later learn as well. Now, you'll notice something else in one of these pictures as well that's really enchanting, is that there was a water source on her property. And at least in the 20th century, the way that this water source was directed to the spring, which this spring is technically an inlet here, you'll see that they used hollowed out logs. And these were pine in the most recent iteration of them. And I was able to photograph them before they rotted to pieces. Now, basically, there's just a wet swale going down to where you can see there's a little retaining edge where the water would flow. You could collect water directly there like a spigot. And it also went underneath the pad directly in front of the bake oven and into the milk house. And there's an area that's about 3 feet deep for cooling the milk right there. And these are both structures that were there during the time of her life. And it's also believed that there was a log building there as well. And there are accounts of people who visited her during her life, some primary sources, some really lovely reflections on her property. But the log house no longer stands. There is some speculation that logs from that log house could have somehow been recycled into the barn, which currently stands. It's probably from around 1830, and a farmhouse that's from around that time as well. But we don't know for sure. There's been no conclusive evidence. One thing that would shed light on that would be dendrodating, where they take a core sample and then they compare that scientifically to all the data they have on tree growth, and you can match up the yearly cycles and you could determine what year the trees were felled. But to my knowledge, nothing like that has ever taken place yet. Now, the most important source for describing Mary's farm during her life is an interesting source that was written in 1819, the very same year that she passed away. She passed away in November of 1819, and this was the summer of 1819. And there was a Philadelphia Quaker, an influential fellow by the name of Benjamin Hollinshead, who came to the Oley Valley. He came attended by a colleague of his, also a Quaker, by the name of Jesse Thompson. And what's interesting is that he goes to visit friends by the name of Benjamin Wright. And I did a little bit of research and found out that Benjamin was married to Anne Wright. And what's really interesting is he describes visiting them in their home in Oley and then going with them to visit Mountain Mary. And he doesn't say why they're visiting Mountain Mary. He makes it sound like, oh, it's just a pleasant thing to do. Let's just go up into the hills and visit the Hermit Mary. However, a little bit of research that I was able to do indicated that later that year, Anne Wright gave birth to a son who was named Benjamin Hollinshead Wright. So Benjamin and Anne Wright named their child after Benjamin Hollinshead. So she was pregnant at the time. And one could wonder, we don't know for sure, but one would wonder if Mountain Mary served in the capacity of a midwife, because stories about her healing have been far and wide. So no one knows precisely what it was that she was doing. We do know, however, that in her will, she makes provisions for her niece to receive all of her books and manuscripts after her death, and her heirs do go and pick them up. So this is a really interesting thing. What were those manuscripts containing? Were they midwifery manuals? Were they registers of births? There's a fabulous midwifery manual here in the collection at the Schwenkfelder, associated with Rosina Heydrich, who was an 18th century midwife in Lower Salford Township. And she has a register of all the names of all the births that she attended, her and likely her daughter as well. And it's a wonderful resource that also has chapters that pertain to healing methods and techniques specifically for mothers and children. Was this similar to the type of manuscript that Mountain Mary would have been keeping? We don't know. And no one has been able to track down those manuscripts. However, there was a state folklorist at one point in time by the name of Henry Shoemaker, who claimed that he knew where they were located and that he had seen them, but that he didn't feel comfortable writing about them. And Shoemaker was later considered both a celebrated figure and also a little bit of an exaggerator. So we don't know if that story is actually true or not. But according to Hollinshead's visit, they go to the site and he describes Mary and all of the stories he hears about Mary in advance that kind of prime him for this visit. And he claims that her understanding was so far-reaching that it was seen as though she was guided by something other than human judgment, something beyond that. So she was considered to have this holy reputation that she could tell things about people that maybe they didn't know about themselves, or maybe that they had not informed her of. So someone who was seen as a seer, someone who would be able to tell you something. Also potentially helpful if she is a healer. Medical diagnostics could be related to that in some way. He describes his meeting with Mary, and I'll just paraphrase it here because you probably already read the whole thing. There's a lot of text up there, and I apologize for that. But it says, she spoke in a religious strain, informing us through someone who was serving as an interpreter, that she was obligated to speak her native tongue, the German. And her marks breathed a strain of devotional feeling, which had a solemnizing effect upon the company, and the countenance of the speaker was one of the most benign I had ever beheld. So he has this lofty, poetic description of Mary. What's lovely about this is that he describes that while Mary and Anne Wright, who he does not name, he just says the lady of our party, was attended to by Mary in her home, I and the rest of the men walked the property. So this would have been Jesse Thompson, who I was able to locate the fact that he is also a healer. He's an apothecary. So there was also, again, a healing component to this visit. So Benjamin Hollinshead, Jesse Thompson, and Benjamin Wright walk the property, and he provides a description of all of the different components that we just went over, including as well, not only the spring, but then also the areas where her cows were grazing and her gardens and everything else. So the first description of Mountain Mary's farm is from 1819. What's really fascinating is that there are many different accounts and artists later on who would depict aspects of Mary's farming. Mary was seen in this case as someone who was able to be entrepreneurial in the sense that not only was she engaged in the farming and successful enough at it, but later on there are accounts that suggest that she was highly profitable at it and that she carried the portions of her cheese and butter and other aspects of what she was selling, including her honey, down the mountain on her head to deliver them to one of her neighbors. And that neighbor was a local Quaker by the name of Isaac Lee, who would then take her produce to Philadelphia and sell it on her behalf. And that furthermore, she always brought some form of extra that she said, give it to the poor in Philadelphia. So it's a really interesting thing. We have this person who's celebrated somewhat as a folk healer and also a folk hero who's also doing these acts of kindness. And this is part of how people imagined her. What we do know is that there are descriptions of her dairy herd. There are also descriptions of her bringing in hay and grain on her own, living out in the hills of Oley. Now, what's interesting is so much is left unsaid in historical narratives. Do we know for a fact that she harvested all of her grain by herself? Would there have been a document to indicate that her neighbors may have also helped? We don't know. We know that cooperative farming was pretty popular back then. It's hard to discount the idea that she could have had help from her neighbors, especially given that she already had a strong relationship with the Lee family, the Quakers, who live right at the base of the hill and who also sold her her produce at market for her. So it's an interesting thing. We'll never know for sure how Mary went about doing her farming and what the circumstances were because of a lack of documentation. And it's easy to make assumptions, and I always kind of guard against that because hopefully more will come to light. And it's always important to leave room for things to come to light. Now, one of the interesting documents that was produced following her passing, another primary source, was the inventory of her estate. And so basically, this is a typical process where you would have the executors and usually some other person, some form of an appraiser, who would come out, who served in a legal capacity, sometimes affiliated with the county, who would go out and they would go through the property. And the way that they would do it is they wouldn't just go and cherry pick the most valuable things and put them in first. Instead, they would go room by room. And so oftentimes, if you use your imagination, when you look at these types of documents, you can see the way in which they went through her house and they started in her dwelling. And you'll see that they especially start off with talking about her bed and her bedsteads. They go on to talk about a wide variety of different things, including hand scales and spinning wheels and wool and rags. They start talking about different aspects of things that they would find associated with the kitchen, tables and a dough box, all kinds of different things. What's fascinating, as you go through the inventory, you find information that she was definitely churning her own butter. She was definitely spinning her own fiber. She was definitely using flax. There's actually flax that's found, both a flax and a wool wheel. There's also lots of produce as well that you can see. Examples of a bunch of different things, including turnips and a bunch of others. And shingles and other things like that that would have been necessary on the farm. A wheelbarrow. No examples of horses or horse harnesses or any draft animals. Even though she had cows, she could have technically had an ox, but there's no ox yoke. So the belief was she was doing everything with a wheelbarrow. And in Pennsylvania Dutch, they used to have a word for this. They would refer to this kind of a farm as a shubkarik bouwerij because it's a wheelbarrow farm. It's the farm where the person who's operating it doesn't have draft animals. They use the wheelbarrow to get everything in and out. So it's a really interesting thing. One other notable thing, no mentioning of butcher supplies, no raising of pigs, no nothing like that. Was Mary a vegetarian? And this is interesting because this is corroborated possibly by two other sources. Benjamin Hollinshead's account describes that when they're welcomed back into her home, following the men going through the property and a consultation with Anne Wright, they have a lunch prepared for them. And it's examples of her cheese and her butter, fresh baked bread that had been baked that morning, all kinds of preserves and all kinds of other things, but no mention whatsoever of meat products. So it's an interesting thing. There's also a story claiming, as of the 1820s, that she would capture animals that had gotten into her garden, and she would take them up over the mountain and release them. How she would catch a groundhog or something like that and then somehow release it, that sounds like a story in and of itself, because this is before the time people were manufacturing have-a-heart traps. How did she catch that groundhog, and how did she take that angry groundhog over the mountain? No one will ever know, and there's no groundhog traps on her inventory. So some really interesting things. But if we were to itemize this even further, it's really fascinating. They do list her books as well, and also a lot of cash on hand. I think the total we can see down here at the bottom is, I believe it says 853. No, 653. So this is an interesting thing. She had quite a bit of cash on hand, in addition to the value of all of her property as well. Now, Benjamin Hollinghead's story is wonderful from 1819, but I have a disappointing piece of news, and that was that it was only actually made available to the public for the first time in 1903. So all of the people like Vollenweber, who went on to tell her story, the newspaper man from Philadelphia, who wrote a novella about Mountain Mary, about her being a revolutionary war widow, all of these people supplied those narratives about her because there were no other sources to go on. So what's interesting is the person who actually eventually served to compile Benjamin Hollinghead's writings and also do some field work of his own was a man by the name of James Dewey from Philadelphia, who was so enamored with the writings of Benjamin Hollinghead that he decided to go back to Oley himself. And it was just a couple years after her passing. They said a few years. So I'm guessing you could say give or take 10 years, give or take 5 years. We don't know. Let's assume maybe 1825-ish. He goes back and he starts talking to people about her story. And he finds out great details about her dairy and her fields and her meadows, her orchards, that there were many different types of apples and other trees that she grafted herself, varieties of apples that were attributed to her that people refer to as Good Mary's apple, that was at one point in time popular in the Oley Valley. That was Mountain Mary's own strain. You'll also find that stories of her grading the roadways to get up the mountain. There were other properties adjacent to hers, but there were no roads. So people had to basically go through paths, footpaths. And she apparently went out with a grubbing hoe and she helped to grade the roads to make it easier for other people to get up the mountain, and of course for herself as well. And they also describe in there about her elaborate gardens that she used to provide the herbs for her healing practices, which is one of the first and earliest references to her as a healer, despite her wide reputation as a healer. And also they mention vegetable gardens as well. And that's where the story comes from, about this idea of her capturing marmots that get into her garden and later releasing them. He also describes that she was well off, and that she especially got her income from her sizable dairy herd, her honey, and that she had a lot of beehives. They don't number them, but they also say something else that's very interesting. He mentions that she does bloodletting. And this is a really interesting factor as well, because if she was a healer, this would have been a common healing technique during that time. People typically at that point in time believed that illness in the body was the result of an imbalance of fluids in the body, the four humors, and that you would balance them by bleeding the person to restore balance to the human body. So this is an interesting thing. Now, the stories that Dewey collects are also the same stories that circulate throughout the 19th century about Mary taking her produce to market on her head. Dewey records this in the 1820s. And then later, a guy by the name of Frank Brown, who became the editor of the Reading newspaper, he wrote a lot of local stories. And he had done some work circa 1880, 1890, collecting Mountain Mary stories. He confirmed a lot of the material that James Dewey collected, but James Dewey's material also was not available until 1903. So it's really interesting to note that these accounts languished in an archive and were only published for the very first time in 1903 in a publication called The Pennsylvania Dutchman, which is really interesting. Now, this photo here on the left depicts a reenactor, a popular reenactor by the name of Ronnie Backenstow, who should be 103 at this point in time, a friend of mine who lives down in Wernersville, but who has for many years spoken about her experiences reenacting Mountain Mary at the Goshenhoppen Folk Festival and also at our events up at Kutztown. And this is her right outside of our barn portraying Mountain Mary. She was so convincing at her Mountain Mountain Mary outfit, that people would think that she was somehow a person who dressed that way all the time. In fact, we even had her, she sat down to rest one day on a bench during one of our big events, and it was Easter on the farm, and someone said, "Hey, do you need anything? Can I get something for you?" They were offering to buy her some food at the concession stand because they thought that she was an unhoused person. So interesting. Ronnie was very convincing, but she carried a basket of herbs with her, and she would talk about Mountain Mary and the stories associated with her healing and her sainthood. On the right, there's this picture of a woman, of course, that helped to inspire Mountain Mary's garb as portrayed by Ronnie Backenstow. And this is an illustration that was done by Leroy Gensler, an illustrator associated with the mid-1900s, the Kutztown Folk Festival. He did a lot of their illustrations for their promotional materials and a lot of other publications, including the Reading Eagle. He made this particular illustration based on an illustration done by Frank Brown in the Reading Eagle in the 1880s. So it's a fascinating thing, and this shows Mountain Mary using 2 canes, carrying her cheese to market on her head. Well, she's actually only carrying it to Isaac Lee's house, who is then essentially going to sell it at market for her, down the mountain with 2 canes. So this is one of those classic images you'll see repeated often based on those stories. Sure. If you could, that'll just ensure that we'll get everything in, and then we'll have plenty of time for those people who need to move on to other things. And I'll just make sure that we have plenty of time for questions at the end. But thank you, I appreciate it. Now on to one of the aspects of her story that I think many of you are probably waiting to hear about. Let's hear about Mountain Mary's healing. A lot of people recognize Mountain Mary specifically in the capacity of how she was described as a healer. And everybody wants to know, was she an herbalist? Was she a trained physician of some sort? Was she a country doctor who learned through field experience? Was she a midwife? Was she a powwow doctor? Everybody wants to know what kind of medicine she did, and there are no records to indicate, except those documents that were outlined in her will that were given to her niece's heirs. And we don't know what happened to them. So if we could find those, we would know. However, Mary and stories of her healing and depictions of her healing have been around for a long time. This particular tapestry you see here on the left was created by a celebrated block print artist by the name of Paul Weand, who was also a celebrated Pennsylvania Dutch playwright. You'll see it has Mountain Mary at the top, and then it says Baraka Marika. And what's interesting is you'll see many different vignettes on this tapestry showing her as a person caring for other people through medicine, through distributing goods, through churning her butter, all kinds of different things. There's images of the church from Hill Church, which we believe she probably wasn't actually affiliated with, and then also her cemetery. Lots of different aspects of her story portrayed. And this was a lovely example of a collaborative piece produced at Kutztown University in 1938. Weand was the person who coordinated it. Henry W. Sheridan, who was the head of the art department at that point in time, suggested that they do this project, and a lot of other locally celebrated people contributed to it, including a woman by the name of Gladys Lutz, who was referred to as the Grandma Moses of the Lehigh Valley, who depicted all kinds of scenes of farm life in local paintings. They all contributed to this, and they even had their school students. All of these were school teachers, art ed teachers, who had their school students assist with the process of drafting the images, cutting them, and then printing them. And we have 2 examples of this at our archives at the Heritage Center at Kutztown, showing aspects of her healing. One of the vignettes shows Mary holding the hand of a young person who's kneeling at her feet, and she is reaching out to touch the person. We think this could be a reference to the idea of ritual healing, because at that point in time, it was very common, especially among female healers in the 18th and early 19th centuries, for female healers to heal using a wide range of traditional techniques that included not only herbs, not only different materia medica, but also the laying on of hands and the use of prayer. And so she may have been a religious folk healer as well, but we don't know. One thing that's really important to note is that some folks will say, well, she only practiced herbalism. Some people might object to the idea that she could have a ritualistic aspect to her healing. Many people have suggested that, well, if she belonged to one particular denomination or another, that denomination might disagree with those forms of healing practices. or ritual healing in general. But what's really fascinating is that during that time period, most herbal medicine had a ritual component to it. Whether it was the time that you were to harvest an herb, you might harvest an herb such as elderberry, which is in the very middle here. Elderberry was often harvested during the time of Ascension Day. You would scrape the bark, and the bark was used for a variety of different purposes as an emetic. It was also used to make tea, to reduce inflammation. All kinds of different salves could be made from it. The blossoms could be used as well, specifically for making tea that was anti-inflammatory. Typically, you did that on Ascension Day, so there's a ritual component to it. People also associated the elderberry with the Virgin Mary, so there was also a religious component to that, a ritual component. You'll also see on this side a yellow powder and 2 pouches. Those 2 pouches were owned by a friend of mine by the name of Clark Hess, who is from the Cocalico Valley. They're asafoetida bags. Has anybody ever heard of this? A couple people. Well, my grandfather told me about this when I was a kid, except he called it asperfidity, which is one of those local pronunciations that kind of indicates people have trouble saying the original Greek word, which is asafoetida. And it is a very pungent herb that was believed to protect you from sickness. You put it in a little bundle around your neck and you wore it to school, just like my grandfather did in the 1940s. And he said it was so pungent that kids would never get near you. And that is one of the reasons why it would protect you from illness. And it's actually a resin that comes from a plant in the allium family in the Middle East. And they would cut the edge of the stalk and a resin would come forth. The resin would get collected up and dried and would be kind of like a yellowish brown powder that could then be powdered and put into an asafoetida bag. Now, the one on the far side, plantain. Plantain's a common thing. Many people, probably from previous generations, even remember a time you would chew the leaves of it and put it on a bee sting. Anybody ever heard of that? A couple of you? All right. There's also other rituals that were done with herbs. Christopher Sauer, who was the printer of the very first full-length Bible in North America in 1743, he was a Dunkard, lived in Philadelphia in Germantown. I should say he lived in Germantown, which is part of Philadelphia today. He produced one of America's first botanical books of medicine as a serial in his local almanac. And in it, he included a ritual that to reduce a fever, you should use plantain. But he says what you got to do with the plantain is take the root of the plantain and you dig it up and you put it in a bundle around the person's neck for 3 successive days. Then you take it and you either bury it in the manure pile or you throw it into water that is flowing in the direction of the setting sun. And the belief was that this would take the fever away. And so here we have a person who was an elder in the Brethren Church collecting and also distributing and publishing herbal remedies that were of that nature. So I want to warn everybody that when we talk about botanical medicine, it's often a blended form of medicine that would have contained elements of both materia medica, looking at the chemical properties of plants and how they directly affect the human body chemistry, but also the ways in which people have relationships with plants that are expressed through ritual, sometimes religious, sometimes supernatural. Now, one thing I thought was really especially interesting about James Dewey's account from circa 1825, if we want to say that was the time. Again, that's a speculation, but we're not sure. It could be any time shortly after Mary's death. He had an interesting inscription that I want to clarify. He says that not only was she a very intelligent and religious woman, talked about all the people visiting her for their difficulties. Clearly, in this case, it could be any number of different types of difficulties. So she's a person who was an advisor in addition to a healer. And he said that she was seen as so judicious and far-seeing that it was thought by some that she had a way of acquiring knowledge that was unknown to many. So there's this allusion to the idea that she somehow or other may have had some form of additional sight, that she could see things that other people couldn't. She could make connections that other people couldn't. And we can speculate on what that would have meant. Did she use divination? Was she psychic? There's all kinds of different things that people have said over the years, and we don't know anything about the specifics of it. We do know, however, the statement that James Dewey made. We can make a lot of inferences, but I kind of guard against being too strong about any of those inferences. Again, I hope more sources come to light over the years, because remember, we waited almost 100 years to get access to the material that James Dewey and Benjamin Hollinshead put together. Who knows? More could come to light, and that's a really important thing to keep your mind open about that. He does mention one interesting thing. He mentions that she practiced vivisection. And this term is usually applied to a person who is a scientist who performs, what shall I say, dissections on live animals. Now, given the fact that in the same account, Dewey also says that she never harmed animals, it's very hard for me to understand what he might have meant by vivisection. But it's very close to another word that was used at the same time period to describe the bloodletting practice that I mentioned, and that is venesection. And so the belief is that she was probably practicing, at that point, they'd use the term venesection, phlebotomy, or bloodletting. Among the Pennsylvania Dutch, they'd use the word aderlassing, which literally means to open a vein. And this was, again, orchestrated according to the Farmer's Almanac. Here are two examples of local Farmer's Almanacs, one from Reading, one from, I believe, Philadelphia, that has instructions. It shows the body of the human, and it shows all the different signs of the zodiac that are associated with the parts of the body. And it gives instructions, and it says that you are not supposed to bleed the part of the body when the moon is within that particular sign on that particular day. That's not what you're supposed to do. In fact, you're supposed to look at the properties associated with the phases of the moon and the signs of the zodiac to achieve the desired result, because every single sign of the zodiac was associated with the four elements, and the four elements were associated with the four humors, but it doesn't tell you how to do that, because everybody knew that. So these are the kinds of things that when we look at historical documents, we have to remember. This was so popular. This was in the back of every farmer's almanac. There were thousands of almanac titles published over many centuries here in Pennsylvania, included this image, even today in Bear's Almanac. I don't think people are using it anymore the same way. But what's interesting is this is there, and the knowledge is still implicit. So we have to remember how much is left up to the imagination, and how much, I should say, how much is left up to the imagination today, but how much was left up to essentially popular oral knowledge that was passed from person to person. And this is such an important thing to be aware of. Now, many people associate Mountain Mary with powwowing, and I don't want to suggest one way or the other whether or not Mountain Mary is a powwower, but I will say she had the reputation of being a powwower in the 19th century. There are many stories associated with her. And powwowing, as it is often called in English today, years ago, people also used the term brauche or braucherei, which means to treat with ritual medicine. Both of these terms are used interchangeably, and powwowing has a long history associated with Pennsylvania Dutch healing practices going back to its earliest instance of being recorded with that word, powwowing, in the 1790s in Berks County. But the tradition ultimately comes from German-speaking parts of Europe. People would use prayers associated with the saints, with the Holy Trinity, prayers associated with the Virgin Mary, and they would often use these prayers that were rhyming. They had a cadence. They would be chanted. The person would hold their hands over the person's body. The healer would hold their hand over the person's body while reciting a prayer that some folks will refer to as a prayer or an incantation. There's a lot of different ways that people describe it, but ultimately these types of healing traditions would not have been outside of the realm of possibility for Mountain Mary, because there were many country doctors during that time, even some in Oley, who were using these particular traditions, and they were fully trained medical doctors. So this is a really interesting thing. I have a doctor's ledger from the 1830s, likely from a gentleman by the name of Enoch Griesemer, and it has powwowing materials in it. Prayers for how to remove warts under the waning of the moon. Does anybody know of that ritual? Anybody heard about powwowing warts away? A couple people here. These are long-standing traditions. If you would ask people even 15 years ago in this area, older generations would remember these traditions very, very well. Mountain Mary's story, though, parallels another popular powwow healer who was well known all throughout southeastern Pennsylvania. Her name was Sophia Leininger, later Sophia Baylor. And the interesting thing is that she was regarded as being such an effective healer that people referred to her as the saint of the coal regions. Yet again, another healer who's referred to as a saint, not a canonized saint, not a Roman Catholic saint, not a Protestant saint, but someone who on a folk cultural level seemed to embody the values of their culture through caring for other people in significant ways. And I'm going to go back to that a couple times in this presentation, this idea that Mountain Mary was also one of those people who embodied the values of her culture in a way that has led to her story being told continuously since the time of her passing and up to the present day. Now, a little bit of folk cultural research of my own overlaps with some stories about Mountain Mary. Now, what's really interesting is if you talk to local people about many of the old either powwowing prayers or old weather proverbs that people will say, there's a name of a woman by the name of Mary who pops up in these. Now, I had always thought it was the Virgin Mary, but what you find is you'll see scenarios like this: an incantation for purging parasites that describes Mary going over the land, having 3 worms in her hand, one that is white and one that is black and one that is red, and with that she strikes the worms dead. And the belief was the powwower would rap gently on the person's back, and that would cause the parasites inside of a person's body to die. And of course, this was a common ailment. If you lived on a farm, people got worms pretty often. So this is one of those powwowing incantations that mentions Mary. Now, I'm very familiar with the idea among Roman Catholics. Our Dear Lady refers to the Virgin Mary. But in the folk cultural imagination of the Pennsylvania Dutch, many people don't know this because there were only about less than 1% of Pennsylvania Dutch people were Roman Catholic historically. So that's a really interesting thing. Another thing is this weather proverb that I've collected from a number of local people through oral histories. They would begin it by saying, Van die Maria over de barricade, which means when Mary goes over the mountain. And then there were several different iterations, but usually it means that if she goes over the mountain to visit her sister, and they're talking about the visitation of the Virgin that takes place on May 31st in the liturgical calendar, when Mary visits Elizabeth, even though Elizabeth is Mary's cousin, according to the Gospels. They say, if it is dry weather at that point in time, it will be wet when she returns. Because in the folk cultural imagination, Mary goes over the mountain, she goes over on May 31st, and she comes back on August 15th. August 15th is the date in the liturgical calendar of the Assumption of Mary. Most people who are Protestants don't pay attention to this. It was still in the Farmer's Almanac, though. Many local Protestants didn't even know what the Assumption of Mary was. But according to the Roman Catholics, this is when the Virgin Mary ascended into heaven. So you can see how these are informed by Roman Catholic traditions in many ways, but local people don't always have the context to put these together. One person I interviewed back in 2021 about this weather proverb and a bunch of other things, this was a woman by the name of Dolores, who was a fluent speaker of Pennsylvania Dutch, and we conducted our interview mostly in PA Dutch. And then I said to her, I said, "Who is die Maria?" I said, "Who is Mary? Who is it? Who are you talking about?" And she specifically said, "Gosh, I don't know. Do you think it's Mountain Mary?" Because in her mind, she connected this with the story of Mountain Mary, not the Virgin Mary. So this is an interesting thing, how Mountain Mary's story, through aspects of healing and religion and folklore, get connected in the popular folk cultural imagination. So this is a really interesting thing. Now, the idea of Mary being venerated as a saint is a really interesting aspect to her story, and no one precisely knows when that notion began. Did it happen during her life? Was it because of the fact that she was considered an abbess? Was she considered a saint while she was still walking the earth, or was this something that followed her as her reputation continued to grow following her passing? Dr. Don Yoder, who was one of the organizers of the Kutztown Folk Festival and leading scholar of folk life studies in the United States, said that she was essentially the Pennsylvania analog to the European saints legend. And Don had spent a lot of time in Europe studying local saints. And this is where pretty much every village in different parts of formerly Roman Catholic areas of Europe had people that they venerated. Some were officially canonized as saints by the Roman Catholic Church. Some were only recognized on a local level. And he said that this is really the pattern associated with Mountain Mary. Now, this depiction that we have over here of a pious woman is not Mary, but it was used by a number of different, used on the cover of a number of different local chapbooks. This was produced in Ephrata and tells the story of another local female saint by the name of Genoveva, a story told in Pennsylvania that is associated with a Palatine count. In many cases, she's attributed to Brabant. But the interesting thing is these stories of female saints get superimposed here in Pennsylvania. And this idea of the pious female living in the wilderness is one of the most popular motifs that you find in Pennsylvania Dutch folk cultural legends. I believe that the origin of her story probably dates to sometime around the time of her passing that she was considered a saint. In a manuscript that we have in the Heritage Center's collection associated with Daniel Bertolet, who was a preacher, a hymnist. He was also, at one point in time, a Pennsylvania state senator. He wrote an entry in his daybook on the 18th of November, 1819, that said, "Today, Mary of the Mountain," and this is the very first known source where anyone referred to her as Mountain Mary or Mary on the Mountain. It says Mary on the mountain was buried. And it says in quotes, Help, Lord, for thy saints have been reduced, which is a biblical verse. And it's a really interesting thing. This is the very first time that the word saint appears in conjunction with her name. Is it possible that Daniel Bertolet, as a local preacher, was the one who presided over her funeral? Maybe this was her funeral inscription. It was very common that a funeral text was read at someone's funeral. Is that part of what added this idea of her being a local saint? We don't know. But he also goes on to say that she looked very lovely and that without a doubt she entered into eternal rest. But that's not all that he put into his manuscript. The one interesting thing is that in her own estate, she left money for there to be a wall built around a cemetery that already existed on her property. There are 4 graves in it. One for her sister, one for her mother, according to local tradition, one for her, and one for someone we don't know who they were. And it was always said that they were all women. And many people said, well, that's her other sister. I have a hard time imagining that her other sister was buried there if she was in Albany, New York. It's possible, but we don't know. So this is what the cemetery looks like today. And you'll see various photographs over the years of it. In fact, there's a photo in the H. Winslow Fagley collection here at the Schwenkfelder that shows Mountain Mary's grave, and it's just surrounded by a bunch of rubble. We do know that there was a wall that was actually built, and it has since been repaired. When it was repaired, and I want to say it was 2008 when it was repaired, I know the stonemason who did the work, they found a dog skeleton, had been hidden in the wall on the western side. An old tradition for guarding the perimeter, that there was a dog, some faithful dog was put in the wall as a way to protect the grave, which is a really interesting thing. Again, another one of these ritual traditions that we don't know a lot about because nobody wrote about it. We only find the dog skeleton. Now, I mentioned that Daniel Bertolet had another interesting passage in his ledger, and it says Grabschrift von Maria Jung, and then it goes on to say what day she was buried. And it's poetic, and it's written in 4 stanzas, and it says, "Here under this stone softly rest the bones of pious Mary. Her heart and whole life were devoted to her God, as anyone could see from her way of life. Untiringly, she lived in solitude until 30 years had passed. The lines of her face revealed God's love with which the Lord rewarded her. Yet even after her departure, one saw the sweet pace in her countenance, full of love and bliss, as always directed towards the Son of Grace. Now she is taken away. God, call her unto thee from this valley of tears, where in the meadows of heaven she will behold Jesus among his chosen number." This was written by an evangelical minister. So he, of course, provided these lofty, poetic, religious refrains. And I have to wonder, did he pen this after her passing, and did he read it at her graveside? Was this part of her service? Was this part of a funeral homily? We don't know. We have no idea. Another option is she may have been a Quaker because she had so many connections to the Quakers, and maybe that's another reason why no one can find the records. I think they would technically be at Swarthmore based on the Oley meeting and the location of those, but no one's been able to find them yet. So that's a really interesting thing. Again, this Grabschrift or her funeral text is something that I think we could have a lot of speculation about how it was used. And it's been, of course, translated many times over the years. Now, following Mary's death, at some point, people started doing annual pilgrimages, and we don't know why, and we don't know when. We do know that, of course, people regarded her as a local saint. Many people would visit in the time of the spring. Some people even said, oh, she was probably born in the spring, but we really don't know. We don't know when she was born. One of the artifacts of that pilgrimage series was produced in 1945 by Henry W. Sheridan, who was the head of the art program at Kutztown University. He painted this triptych of her. You can see her in the center, dressed as an 18th century farm woman. You see examples of all kinds of different vignettes and stories associated with her life, and then little captions going along with them, showing her reading her Bible, attending the sick, harvesting grain, spinning flax, all kinds of different things. And this was actually brought to the graveside as part of the celebration. And here you can see Sheridan in his studio as well. And some of these pilgrimages still go on today. And what's fascinating is that I had organized one in 2009. What's fascinating is that Different groups at different times have done this: Sunday school groups, church groups, historical groups. It's one of those things that has kind of happened intermittently throughout the years. I know I go down to the grave as often as I can in November, usually around the time of her passing, and I'll often bring a colleague who hasn't been there before, and I know the owners of the property. It is on private property, and I recognize that that makes it a unique scenario. You also have to walk under an electric fence, avoid two bulls, and then go under another electric fence before you get to it. So I highly recommend that if you have interest, that you talk to the property owners before you would ever go on their property. Just a little bit of etiquette. The bulls probably wouldn't appreciate otherwise. So this was an interesting thing to be part of one of these efforts. And what I found was interesting is that about half of the people there were very interested in Pennsylvania Dutch culture as examples of very traditional ways of looking at things. The other half were newer generations of people who were associated with alternative spiritual modalities, other religions other than Pennsylvania Dutch iterations of Lutheran or Reformed or Schwenkfelder or any number of other different groups. And what's fascinating to me is that Mountain Mary's story continues to be relevant to different groups of people in different ways. I want to wrap up my presentation today by saying that no matter how you look at Mountain Mary, no matter how Mountain Mary might be meaningful to you, the interesting thing is that her story is still being written, it is still being researched, it is still being told, it is still being reenacted and celebrated through poetry and works of art. Her story is ongoing. We're actually part of it today in a very real sense, in the idea that we're all here today being curious about her story and seeking answers, where in some cases we may not have those answers today. You never know what's going to turn up in the future. So I want to thank you all for coming out today and being part of that story with me, and for welcoming me here at the Schwenkfelder. I also want to make one quick announcement too, that if you are interested in one of the exhibition catalogs associated with the Mountain Mary exhibition, I have a case of these today. These were from 2022. It was a collaborative exhibition at Kutztown University. They are for sale today, and you can come up to the front afterwards if you want to get one. But I want to open up for some questions, because I think when it comes to Mountain Mary that the questions are sometimes as important as the answers. So I appreciate your questions, and I appreciate those of you who've held on to them throughout. There was a question right here in the front. You're technically the first person to ask a question, and you've been very patient. What was your question? And then I have these two gentlemen back here. Yes, of Ronnie Backenstow. Yes. Really good question. I don't have any knowledge whatsoever about whether or not Mary actually smoked a pipe. I do know that the Mountain Mary reenactments that took place at the Goshenhoppen Historians. Just repeat the question. Okay, I will repeat the question. Thank you. The question was, there was an image included in the presentation. I'm sorry for not repeating the question sooner. It had to do with Mountain Mary's pipe. Mountain Mary was depicted by Ronnie Backenstow, and she didn't actually smoke the pipe, thankfully, and that's probably one of the things that kept her around so long. She's 103 right now. She would carry this corncob pipe, and many people associate Mountain Mary with smoking of a pipe. And I don't actually know of whether or not there are any sources to corroborate that. There are, however, stories that have kind of echoed that performance. There may even be some sources associated with some of the storytelling throughout the 20th century. And there are a lot of stories about Mountain Mary out there. Probably, again, I would say one of the most celebrated Pennsylvania Dutch figures of all time, especially the most celebrated female Pennsylvania Dutch historical figure of all time. So there's many perspectives. I can't say for sure where the pipe comes from, but I do know that it was not uncommon for people to smoke a pipe. It was also not uncommon for people to use snuff at that point in time. Whether or not Mountain Mary did either of those, I have no idea. It certainly adds some flavor to her character, though. All right, the other question I saw was right back here, sir. Yes. Stuff and treated over history. Do you have any idea why she never made the papers? Why she never got, because of, and I know you don't have a lot. Do you have a speculation on what it was about her that kept her immune from being persecuted? It's a really good question. And I actually don't know of any instances of her showing up in 18th century newspapers or early 19th century newspapers, other than some examples of things that turn up in the 1840s. There was a poem that was published by Mrs. Charles Evans, and I feel so terrible, I can't remember her first name. I think it was Catherine Evans. Charles Evans was one of the most wealthy people in Reading City who established a massive cemetery in his name. In the 1840s, there was an ode to her that was put in the Reading Eagle, written by I believe it's Catherine Evans. So she did end up in the newspaper, and that ode to her was this long-standing story, kind of talking about her virtues and her healing and other things like that. So she did get in the newspapers, but not really related to her time period. One interesting story, another woman from Reading, a celebrated matriarch from the city of Reading by the name of Susanna de Benneville Cox, and I meant to mention this earlier. Susanna de Benneville Cox was the person who attended Mountain Mary on her deathbed. And one might ask the question, how did she know that Mary was sick? Well, the story that was relayed over generations, but among members of her family, that she counted herself as being so lucky to have been able to attend Mountain Mary. She lived in Reading, and she was the wealthiest woman in Reading at that point in time. She had a dream that Mountain Mary was sick and that Mountain Mary had called to her and asked her to come out to attend to her. And she and her grandson got on their horses and they traveled an icy road all the way up from Reading to Pike Township, where they found that she had been in her house. She was bedridden. The fire had gone out several days before. It was in November. She was very cold and she was dying, and they attended her until the time that she passed away. Again, another one of these supernatural stories. She appeared in Susanna de Benneville Cox's dream. Very interesting. And yet, nobody was writing about her during that time. That didn't make it into the local papers. I would have thought that was newsworthy, but it didn't. So good question. Why was she immune to this? I guess one question would be, did everybody know about her to the degree that we know about her today? Was it considered of interest? Did people think very highly of her and therefore omit any stories that could be held against her? Who knows? That's all speculation. But I value the questions, because to me, there's something about her story that can be known through these questions, at the very least, how we view her today, and how she's important to us. I saw another hand over here at one point. How about the very back? Yeah. Well, so we don't know where she was born. We know that she was a German-speaking immigrant who came to Pennsylvania sometime around or before 1765, is what several historians have said, but they never really give a good reason for why that date was put in place. So it's interesting. She could have come from the Rhine River Valley, which is where many people who were coming to Pennsylvania were coming from. But there were also equally as many immigrants who came from a wide range of different German-speaking regions of Europe. Some who were coming, like, for instance, the Schwenkfelders, who have connections over to the eastern border of what is today Germany and Poland, Silesia. You've got examples of Moravians coming from similar areas. You've got examples of people from all over. So really, you've got folks from Germany, Switzerland, what is today Alsace. You've got examples of people from Austria. So we don't really know where she was from. Some people have said Zweibrücken. I have no idea why. There's no document to indicate. Other people have said, oh, no, she came from Baden-Württemberg. Okay, all right. There are many different perspectives of where she came from. Some people said she came from the Pfalz. Some people said she came from Switzerland. No one has any basis to those assertions that have ever been published with sources. And I always pay very close attention to the sources. Right here, yeah, question. Yeah. Absolutely. There is a road named in her honor today that goes right by her property, and that is believed to be the road that she graded. There's also there's a placard as well that is located right near her property. It's some distance from her property, that was put up by the Daughters of the American Revolution, and they refer to her as a Revolutionary War era nurse, even though she likely did not serve in the Revolution. We have no information to indicate that. I mean, I guess she technically could have. Folks have claimed that she lived in Germantown up until the time of the Battle of Germantown, at which time her family left. Again, that's speculation. I could spend another 4 hours talking about all the different stories that are either speculation or aren't true or have no sources to back them up. So we really don't know. Right over here.
Said there was a possibility that she might be Quaker. And
Sure.
I know that there's a lot of Quakers down in Maryland. Were there many German immigrants? And I know that it's that part was speculation, but were there many early German immigrants that were Quaker?
Yes. So I'm sorry, I'm not repeating the questions very well. And the last question actually before this one had pertained to Mountain Mary Road and the location of Mountain Mary Road. The next question was about Mountain Mary as a Quaker and whether or not there were many German-speaking Quakers in this area. The answer is yes. In fact, some of the people who helped to found Germantown, they came in 1683. Daniel Pastorius was one of the celebrated leaders of that community who helped to establish Germantown. He was a Quaker. He converted to Quakerism once getting here to Pennsylvania. There were many people who followed his example in that respect, and many who did it of their own inspiration as well. And they were among some of the early abolitionists as well, because there was a very significant petition to the Pennsylvania Assembly at that point in time under the Penn's administration. And the interesting thing was that they were petitioning to outlaw slavery at that point in time, and it was Quakers who were primarily the ones signing it, and there were both English and Pennsylvania German Quakers on that list as well. So there definitely was, and some of them were in Oley. There was the Exeter Meeting House, but there was also what they called the Oley Meeting, and the Oley Meeting was later associated with the Reading Meeting, and was at one point in time disbanded because Exeter assumed some of those members, but the documents went to Reading, and then the documents from the Reading meeting, my understanding is they're kept down at Swarthmore. So at this point, I wasn't able to locate anything pertaining to Anna Maria Jung, among the Quakers at least. It's possible she was a Quaker. We don't know. That could be one of the reasons why there's some form of a disconnect between the documentation associated with her religious experience, which for many Pennsylvania German families, their religious experience is one of the areas that's best documented. Their birth and baptismal certificates, their family Bibles, other things like that would give those types of documents. Another question right here, yes? Yes. There are all kinds of stories and theories associated with that. So basically, the long and short of it is that the term powwowing was used by speakers of English because the term had been used in the early Americas to describe any ritual activity that was not sanctioned by the church, and that included activities that were put on by Europeans. So this was a term that was actually absorbed into the English language from the Algonquin languages in New England. And it was used in a pejorative sense. Originally, it meant a healer, and that term eventually was absorbed into the English language and widely used by people who had no contact with the Native American communities. It is entirely possible that there were Native Americans in Oley during that time. Whether or not they would have had anything to do with whether or not people later would have used the term powwowing to describe what Mountain Mary was doing, that gets very speculative. But the term powwowing is independent from Mountain Mary's story in the sense that it was a well-established term used by English speakers to describe the ritual traditions of the Pennsylvania Dutch. And those traditions are so well documented that there's no Native American components that we are aware of today. I think that's an area people could do more research to try to find crossovers. What we do find is that there is actually examples of some powwowing techniques that were used among German-speaking immigrants that actually found their way out to Oklahoma by means of the Delaware. So there was a connection, but we do have documents of the fact that some of the German-speaking traditions ended up in Oklahoma among the Delaware Indians, but we don't have examples of the way in which the Native American traditions may have informed European traditions. I'm sure they did to some degree, but to what degree that is, we don't know. Sure, yeah. Would it be in form or healing practice, or would it be an oral tradition? Well, we do know that she had books and manuscripts, and it was plural for both of those. Would those have been purely religious books? Maybe. Were they purely medical books? We don't know. What we do know is that she made a point to pass them down to a female relative. And that is really significant because if she was a midwife, it is entirely possible that she was passing this on to another woman because that her niece was, expected to carry on some aspect of midwifery, which was not typically done by men. Other aspects of healing and medicine could easily have crossed been practiced by any gender. So the interesting thing with that is, what kind of books and manuscripts did she have? We really don't know. But I would think it's interesting to note that among people who would practice braucherei or powwowing as it's known, that's largely an oral tradition, but there's also plenty of written sources about it, plenty of manuscripts that were kept. So it's hard to say. I would say for medical practitioners during that era, they would have combined a number of different types of sources. There would have been some form of training, whether you were a midwife or whether you were a doctor who studied in Philadelphia at the College of Physicians. Either way, you had some training. Midwives trained with other midwives. So you had some training. You also had, of course, anecdotal information that you would have received from fellow healers, people who also would have told you about a technique that they used. You would have had ways that you would have incorporated remedies that were culturally used within your community that you might have also used as a practitioner. So there's a wide range of different sources that Mary could have drawn on for her healing traditions, but we don't know. I would love to locate those documents because I think they would really provide some lovely insights into her story. Other questions? I know there are a couple here, over here, someone. Absolutely. That is a really good question. There have been some who have said the crux of the Mountain Mary story is that there's no story. And that's a really interesting comment because there aren't recorded instances of her performing miracles. We do know of recorded instances of her helping other people, providing care as a traveling physician to the Oley Valley. So she lived alone, but she traveled to other people, helped other people, had people consult her as well. The instances that I know of where something miraculous occurred, I've tried to weave them as much as I could into the presentation. The idea of her having this kind of extra sight, this far-reaching level of knowledge that couldn't be explained. That's one aspect. The other is the dream of Susanna de Benneville. Susanna de Benneville. Susanna de Benneville, and she was the woman who was the most she was the most wealthy woman in Reading at that point in time in 1819. And it should be Susanna de Benneville Keim. That is her name. So she, of course, seeing Mary in a dream, that's another instance where something miraculous happened. Now, Susanna had said that this was part of, a religious experience. She didn't chalk it up to anything supernatural. Whether that's an example of one of her miracles, we don't know. What I will say is that there are other anecdotes that were documented in the late 19th century by Frank Brown, who was the editor of the newspaper, 1880s, 1890s. He claims all kinds of different stories happened, that Mary was able to heal people of ailments that otherwise wouldn't be treated by medicine. He's not specific about that. But then there's another instance where he claims that an owl would come and visit Mary and steal her milk. And she was always trying to chase this owl away until she finally caught the owl and she burned the owl by the feet. And then the owl got away. And then the next day she found out that a lady who lived on the other side of the valley had burnt feet and that she must have been a witch who was visiting her in the form of an owl and stealing her milk. And so there are these supernatural stories. Now, among the Pennsylvania Dutch, there was nothing wrong with a story like that, depending on who you were. There were some people who would have objected to such stories, but that was one of the 19th century stories. Is that a miracle? Far from it. But it's, again, kind of some of this ritual component and supernatural component to her narrative. Right here, yes. So the Oley Valley, I'm asked, what are the parameters of the Oley Valley? Well, so the Oley Valley today encompasses a number of different kind of geographic areas. It is bordered by a series of mountains that roughly make the shape of a bowl. And the word Oley in Native American in Lenape means kettle, which is believed to be the term of where the valley got its name, because there were Lenape communities in Oley at that point in time. And then a story about how they abruptly left And there's a lot of controversy surrounding that story about under what conditions and why and what the relations were at that point in time. I do know that there was a member of the Bertolet family who, in a family reunion in the 1860s, got up and recited a poem in Lenape, indicating that when she was a child, there were still Lenape community members, enough to have children in that area, and the language was spread between the children who played together. So that's an interesting component. But really what you find is the majority of Oley is right in Oley Township, but parts of it also overlap with Rockland Township, with parts of Pike Township, with parts of, I would say, Exeter Township, a little bit into the area of Richmond Township. It just kind of depends exactly where you're, no, I guess it wouldn't be Richmond. We would have, if I'm thinking about it, we're looking at it and thinking, we definitely have Rockland, we definitely have Pike, we definitely have parts of District, we have Oley Township, Exeter Township. There's probably a few I'm missing, but it really spans an area that is kind of, broadly speaking, a part of what we would consider to be South Mountain, where the mountain range kind of goes through there. And it's a cutout that's geographic that encompasses a number of different townships. And it's close to the border between, Berks County, Montgomery County, and Lehigh County, but by no means against that border. So it's solidly within Berks County. Any other questions? Yeah, sure. It is south of Fleetwood, though. You are right. And right back here, yeah. Yes. And right, yes. It's possible. That part was recorded, yeah. Absolutely. You connected the dots. Yes. So the question is whether or not the story from Benjamin Hollinshead about how the men removed themselves out onto the property while Anne Wright and Mountain Mary consulted by themselves. And does that substantiate the idea that Mary was a healer? And I believe so, absolutely. And that's why I drew attention to it, is the idea that, Benjamin Hollinshead, for whatever reason, felt that it was, the privacy of the Wright family, not to go into any details about the exact nature of why they were there. And he may have done that specifically because he felt that such matters should not have been written about, that was up to the Wrights to talk about their own family affairs. But the fact that Mountain Mary saw Anne privately in her home seems to indicate that there was a consultation. So that is definitely a component of the story that up until recently, I was not able to find any information, pertaining to the nature that she might have been a midwife, although I got that question a lot. And I have done the research to figure out who Anne Wright was and what the circumstances were. And when I found out that she had a son that was born shortly thereafter, who was named after Benjamin Hollinshead, it says that that story was a pretty significant one for the family. Yeah, we could read into that story a lot, but we do know at least that Anne was definitely pregnant during that time and may have been receiving some form of care. All right. Yes, one last question, an online question. I have not been able to find Mary in a tax record at all, but it's entirely possible that she could be. I would be interested to find any additional primary sources. We have a book that's going to be coming out from the Heritage Center, and I wasn't able to find any tax records prior to that time. There's no deeds for her property either. So I should say there are deeds, but they don't go back to Mountain Mary's time. Although there is discussion of deeds in a letter that was associated with the papers of Edith Birch White, that she claims that there is a letter from someone by the last name of Brown in Philadelphia in the 1790s who's requesting copies of 2 deeds, but he doesn't specify what deeds they were. He assumes that she would know, and also mentions some other family details in that letter. So there were deeds. Where they ended up, we don't know. But tax records would be a good place to look, because I'm sure she paid taxes if she had a sizable income. Alrighty, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you again for attending today, and we hope to see you in April when Emma Hartman will be giving her presentation on the research she's doing in the demographics of the Perkiomen Valley from 1730 to 1830. Can we give another round of applause to Patrick Donmoyer? So I can just